Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and as always, I'm so delighted that I get to be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Well, hello there.
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we're so excited to have you join us for our episode over 2017's One Cut of the Dead.
So you've been trying to get me to watch this film for a while now.
Yeah, I saw this film, it's been a year and a half now. I've been talking about this film since I saw it back in 2019.
Yeah, and I want to say that, I want to blame the pandemic because, what else is the pandemic good for if not to blame for why you take so long to see a movie. But I don't know if that's why it took me so long. I think it's because during a good chunk of the year, the only horror I'm watching is horror that I can watch in the background while I'm answering emails. And that's not going to be any foreign film, unfortunately, which means that my backlog of foreign horror is much, much higher than it needs to be. But you're not the only one who recommended this to me, but I have to tell you, up through about 45 minutes into the film, I was like, I'm never trusting anything Anthony says again, because it wasn't bad, but it just wasn't great. And I was like, I don't understand what's happening.
That's all. I think that's just a part of the experience. Everybody has to go through that first, it's a 37-minute long opening shot.
Yes.
Of this film, this fake zombie film. Or, well, I guess what we realize later is a fake zombie film.
Yes. And fake on several levels deep, right?
Indeed.
Because I was watching it and I was like, it's not that this isn't clever, because to be perfectly honest, I can't imagine few things more challenging than doing one cut of a film, right? There's that film Russian Ark, that their tagline is 300 years of history, 2 full-size orchestras, X number of people, and it makes me overwhelmed to just even imagine that, right? So I was down for that, but I'm watching it and there's all these, in retrospect, very clearly why they're this way, but there's all these really weird things that happen, right? Where the actors are freeze, or they're repeating themselves, or the dialogue is meaningless. And again, I was just like, Anthony, why are you having me watch this? It's not that impressive. It's not that good. And I had to watch it in 2 parts because I fell asleep right before they got to the location to start filming the filming. And so I was like, I don't know, please don't make me finish this movie. And then when I started watching the rest of it, I don't remember the last time I laughed so much. It was belly laughs. In part because both you and I have a history of working in theater, right? And so so we know the truth of so much of this film.
Indeed. I love that one of the jokes of which there are many in this film, one of the biggest jokes is on the audience, the literal audience, because that first 37 minutes is riddled with some of, in retrospect, the best, worst acting I think I've ever seen out of anyone. Any actors, any film, any medium. This is some of the finest, good, bad acting.
Yes. Which is one of my favorite things, actually. I love it when people are talented enough to be bad, or to perform bad, right? And you're absolutely correct. Yeah.
It's hard.
It's incredibly hard, and you're seeing them do it on this multiple levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was, so when we get to that second half, it just becomes so delightful to see the depth to which the creators of this film put everything together, right? It's just, talk about really needing to think through your script and your filming and all of that.
Every choice has to be thought about from 3 different angles. Like, can it work in 3 completely different contexts?
Yes.
Does it make sense in terms of, like, the actual televised thing that we see? Does it make sense in terms of what went into the production? And does it make sense in terms of what actually happened on the day of filming?
Yeah.
And that's just so many different intricate and specific levels that it has to work on. And the film does, which is remarkable.
Then, when the credits of the actual film are rolling, right, we get to see that they filmed the filming of the filming, right? And so, like, it's very Inception-y, right? It's the film within a film within a film. And I will say, part of what I found so clever about that premise is that very final shot of the film, of the fake film or TV show, right? Where the camera's being raised up, right? I remember actually thinking, like, I wonder how they did that, because everything else has been handheld. And then not only do we get to see how it can be done if you use a jib arm, but we also get to see how it actually was done by the characters. And that just adds it just became so delightful, right? Because they really answered all of the questions of, like, why is this happening? Like the gentleman in the yellow shirt who drinks the water that makes him sick. When I was watching it the first time, I was like, why is that character just sitting there? What a waste. Like, why is this character even in it? And again, I had all my questions answered as a someone who studies film. I was like, I don't understand why they're doing this. And then
it's super interesting because I think we've been trained, particularly in horror property. I mean, a lot of the horror that we have been talking about recently, it doesn't give you all the answers, and so you have to fill in the gaps. And I think this film really knows that. It knows that the audience is going to be asking questions and is prepared to be like, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, why does this happen? This is silly and ridiculous. I bet there's no reason for it to happen. This film is like, do you really want to know the answers to all those questions? Do you? You really want to know the answers to how everything got done? It's not pretty.
Yeah.
The answers aren't pretty. Why did it happen that way? It's because we had this much money, our actors were this talented, and I had this much time.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because what happens is that when a horror property becomes either beloved or reviled, right? It gets picked apart at that level. And, I say all the time that, like, sometimes the curtains in a story are blue because those were the curtains that happened to be in the room already, right? Mm-hmm. But, like, sometimes, as especially as horror scholars, but also as sort of, like, obsessive horror fans, you're like, but the symbolism of the blue curtains, represents the loss that this person has felt centuries before. And you're like, what? Or the curtains were blue. And so I liked seeing how this text wrestled with it, because it wasn't always exclusively just because of extenuating factors, right? Sometimes it was because of their vision of the story, as well as just like, bad luck and things like that. So I thought that was a really lovely way to show how, even as we should keep reading deeply these little tiny details, we have to understand, like you said, why is there so much blood and why does it spray all over? Because there was a malfunction with the machine. Which we've been circling around this word, but we haven't used it yet, right? And that is that what makes One Cut of the Dead so delightful is that it's a meta-narrative. And you and I have talked about this both explicitly but also sort of implicitly before in our discussions of various horror comedy. But when I think about the horror comedy that works best, for me, 90, 95, maybe even like 99, we're getting real high, but like it's a huge percentage for me of horror comedy that is meta horror, right? Nightmare on Elm Street, Cabin in the Woods, Shaun of the Dead, Happy Death Day, right? All of these are aware and are serving Scream, right, as meta-narratives. So how would you define a meta-narrative beyond the you know it when you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's really tempting to just go with a kind of like, well, a meta-narrative is any time it explicitly references that it is a narrative, it is being filmed, we're inside this world. But I think that's just being meta. I think meta-narrative implies something deeper to the core, is that meta-narratives are texts that are exclusively about the process of making a film or making a thing in a genre, or by examining and peeling back the layers of making this thing or acknowledging it, you're exposing something about this genre, about these themes, about the way that something is done. And so that, I think, that would probably be my operating definition. A film can have meta moments without being a meta-narrative, but meta-narrative implies something, like, I think, just a little bit more overarching.
I agree. So I think there's a couple things that come to mind when I think of a meta-narrative. And one of them is, as you said, there's sort of this acknowledgement that it is itself a property or a work. But to me, what's just as important about that is the sort of expectation on the audience then, right? So in a meta work, there is more labor, if you will, to be done by the viewer, right, or the reader, because you have to understand how to place this text within a larger tapestry. And so I don't know really if you can engage with meta-narratives if you're not familiar with the things that they're sort of looking at and exploring. But I think that it's not just that the text is saying we're aware of these things. It's saying we need from you, the audience, to figure out how to place us within the other texts that you've seen, within the other texts that you've read. So I think there's more of a real sort of symbiotic relationship with the audience.
Yeah, so it's you're broadening the definition to include something larger than, like, the literal narrative or the content of the property itself. This is kind of it refers, at least in some way, to the way the reception or reaction that it intends to evoke from the audience.
I think so. I mean, so I'm sure you can have a meta-narrative text that doesn't do that, but I don't know if you can have an effective or a good meta-narrative text that doesn't, like you said, that's a great phrase, like the audience reception or response, right? It's a real, like, call and response in a way that not all texts do, right? Some texts don't really care who their audience is because the text isn't going to change, but meta-narratives become richer depending on their audiences. So I think that's one of the things I think about. I think the other thing, and you mentioned this, but I just want to agree with how clever of an idea it is that you talked about the fact that it's meta-narratives have, like, stripped away all the layers. They understand, like, down to the atoms, right? Like what makes up something. And so they are so aware not just of, like, characters and plot devices and things like that, but they're aware of, like, pacing and delivery of lines and types of filler shots, right? Like, or just types of conversation cues, right? It's such on a, like, tiny little level, and good meta-narratives are aware of all of those things, not just the, like, hey, so this is a zombie film, so we'll make sure to have zombies, right? It's like, hey, this is a zombie film, so let's think about the people that traditionally become zombies first, right? And it ends up being the people that are the, like, the red shirts of the group, right? And things like that.
And this film is certainly in the genre of meta-narrative horror films, of which, as you've already alluded to and referenced several directly, is a pretty big staple within the horror genre. Meta-narratives are not common, meta-narratives are not uncommon. The commonality is how common they are.
I would argue, though, that, like, the good ones are significantly less common because oftentimes films will, or books or whatever the case might be, will either rely too much on audiences to carry things forward without, like, doing the work themselves in the text, or they'll do the work but they won't, like, allow for that engagement with the audience, right?
It's the difference between a scary movie versus Scream, whereas the in like a scary movie type of situation, the joke is that they've referenced something.
Yes.
And that is where the joke begins and ends. Whereas in Scream, the joke is, yes, they're referencing something, but they're also replicating a specific feel, and the mannerisms and tropes of this genre in order to say something about it. So what is then One Cut of the Dead saying as a metatextual narrative?
That's a really good question. And I think there's multiple answers. So I think we need to talk about the fact that it is a zombie film, right? It may not be a film with real zombies, like no one gets eaten in this film, but it is a zombie film. So I think first, how do we understand or define, beyond just the presence of zombies, a zombie film?
What do you mean?
Yeah, so what I mean is like, if you were to tell someone what the zombie film genre is, right? And if you were to define it as being more than just there are zombies in it, right? Like, how would you explain what the purpose or the point of the zombie genre is?
Well, I suppose based on my previous experience with like what zombie narratives are usually doing is zombies are, as most things in horror, specifically designed to kind of peel back the thing of what makes us scared. Zombies started as a real way of being into consumerism. So, I mean, that seems to be why One Cut of the Dead might choose these types of things, since it's supposed to show the soullessness of the making of art.
Yeah, I think about the fact that zombie films are oftentimes about a collective group of people, right? There are a few exceptions, a few sort of like solo characters. The movie Cargo, the Australian movie from like 2017, 2018, looks at more or less one character who, he has his baby with him, but he's kind of going through the Australian outback. There's another film called The Dead where the main character, it's mainly him and another character, and they're making their way across the African landscape. But really, by and large, it's about the group. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting about this film is that it uses the zombie trope to think about the groups of people, right? And it's not just that we have the filmmakers, but we have the producers, which are such a fantastic group of people, and we kind of get to see that like they are the zombies, right? They're the ones that are like just consuming. One of my favorite lines is when the female producer was like, "Oh, well, I'm so glad that went really well. There was no drama attached to it. Let's go get drinks." Because, then it's like, are they human like us? And we're like, no, maybe they're not, right? And so I think that there was some ways in which the film took production companies and kind of cast the uncanniness of zombies onto the people who take advantage of and who consume actors and creators. So I thought that was an interesting way in which it became a meta-narrative about what it means to have a zombie story.
I think where I was perhaps initially caught off by your question of what is a zombie film is the writer, Shinichiro Irida. He talked about in an interview how he gets asked quite frequently how his film fits in within the larger framework of zombie films and what he hopes his film will accomplish for the larger tropes of the zombie genre. And he responded quite frankly that he doesn't care. He did not intentionally fit this into the zombie genre. He doesn't care how it does. He's like, I don't care. To me, it's not really about the zombies. So it was interesting that was the way in to this conversation.
Well, so I'm glad you brought that up, because even as I think this can be read as a zombie film, it has to be read as a zombie film at the end of the current zombie cycle, right? Mm-hmm. So, the zombie cycle sort of re-peaked around September 11, 2001, and then it kind of carried on pretty strong, and then it started to peter out. And so I think this film and the director-creator's response actually fits perfectly, because a lot of times, especially the more recent and the later zombie films in this current zombie cycle, it's like they couldn't care less that it has zombies, right? It's just that happens to be a really cheap monster to be able to create without you having to create any backstory, because we kind of expect backstory even from like vampires, but for zombies it's just like, well, there was an outbreak, enough said.
Don't you remember back in World War II when they were doing
Pretty much
vague experiments? Well, now there are zombies.
Pretty much. And that's really all that you have to do. And so this also becomes, I think, a really fascinating way for this film to almost unintentionally make commentary on the fact that, like, we're so willing to consume zombie narratives that we don't even care if they make sense or if they fit within the zombie narrative or if they're actually zombie films. And it's delightful.
Wow, it's meta that they made a meta narrative and they didn't care that it was...
Yeah.
They didn't care that it was zombies that they were making that meta narrative about.
See?
And, it's a reflection on the zombie... Aren't we... This, in a way, it kind of feels like we're the same people who they're mocking it with this meta-narrative type of thing. Which I think is also hilarious. The way, as I alluded to in the beginning, kind of the way that it mocks its own audience. The horror audience, the horror fans, the horror community. And it's been really interesting to see that has been, in a large way, kind of celebrated by the horror community. It's been an overwhelmingly positive response to this kind of indie film. It was made it was kind of crowdfunded. It's a student project featuring mostly, like, no-name talents that this guy just kind of put together for $25,000, which is a hell of a lot
That's
cheaper
wild.
than so many of the films we've talked about. Even the films that we've been like, these are low-budget things, it'll then be like, yeah, low-budget, but $90,000.
Right, when you think about, like, Evil Dead, right?
Yeah.
That film is celebrated as being low budget, but it is low budget by Hollywood standards, but it's not by the standards of what money is.
Exactly, and it's just so kind of in this film as how it's looking at how it got made and the reaction has just been really, really positive thing, I think.
Do you know why I think the response is so positive from the audience about them being mocked? Because you're right. We are watching the first 37 minutes and then we are mocked because we realize what a hot mess this 37 minutes that we've watched has been and is.
And we've already paid for.
We've already paid for, right?
We've paid for and watched.
Yeah. And so I think it's one of the best parts of the film, because then you're also reminded of all the other horror you've watched that's also been terrible that you can't even, like, say, well, that was done intentionally. But I think the reason that, like, there's been such a generally positive and warm response is that they're mocking the horror audience, but they're doing it as fellow horror lovers, right? Like I've seen texts and I've read books before where it's clear that the creators have disdain for the audience that they're reaching out to, right? They're upset that they are commercial, and they never wanted to be, or they're upset because their target demographic wasn't who they wanted. And you can actually feel utter disdain from the text from the creator. But in this one, because all of the characters are working so gosh darn hard, they will do whatever it takes to make it so that we get that terrible 37 minutes. It doesn't feel like they're saying, but aren't you the losers, right? They're saying, like, we're all in this together. Now you know just how much we did to bring you this terribly wonderful, horrible thing.
Yeah, I think that it is, in a way, kind of it's critiquing, satirizing the commodification process that under which the horror genre has gone as of late. It's very much the mantra that they keep saying about that director is he's fast, cheap, but just okay.
Right.
And you can't help but maybe think perhaps that they're talking about Blumhouse or something, and some of the, like, kind of schlop that they put out, or these other, like, really low budget things that you, like, the words you hear describe the film is like, oh yeah, it was really easy to make and really cheap, so you know you're going to make a profit. And then there's no regard to the actual quality. Or, like, why was this made? Well, it was made because this is the budget, and we can tell because of other and similar analyses of similar types of films of this similar genre that have these similar types of people in it. It's going to attract this audience. And so it's so broken down. It's all these decisions are being purely made from this highly thought out monetary reasons.
And I think that the way that One Cut manages to deliver that to us is by not letting us forget about the producers, right? So just, it would have been so easy for us to only see the female producer at the very start when he gets the project and then not see them ever again. But it keeps cutting back and forth between the action that's currently being filmed and all those like studio execs sitting there, right? And there's even that point where they're all on their phones, they're not even watching it anymore, and the one guy's like, isn't the scene a little long, and so like it very much reminded me of the sort of, again, we go back to it, right? This idea that like any content is good, even if it's mediocre. And that makes me so incredibly sad. And I think that you're right, that this film is looking at it, but it's also letting us know that even if it's mediocre, that may have nothing or very little to do with how hard the cast and crew worked. And it might have everything to do with the marketing, the production, the script to begin with, right? And I thought that was also a kind of nice, rather pointed message for us to walk away with as horror consumers.
Yeah, it really reminds you to think about, the feelings and the humanness of everyone who is involved in it, which is, honestly not something that a lot you walk away from a lot of horror things thinking about.
Which is strange because we've talked before about how like in The Strangers, that Liv Tyler was like, that was one of the most exhausting things I've ever done, right? Like, so we have all this ample evidence that like being in a horror movie is like world destroying, and yet we never, you're right, we don't really add that into the equation when we're thinking about a film after the fact. I also thought it was interesting though, because one of the things I liked about this film is that it managed to make multiple claims at the same time. So on the one hand, it's saying that, even if it's terrible, it may still be a labor of love or at least commitment. But then at the same time, it's saying, but also, it is a job, right? And I think about like the number of times they're like, can I just use eye drops so that I don't have to like actually cry? And like just thinking about how this film, it's a perfect example of a film that couldn't be made except by people in that world.
Yeah, it has a really specific feel to it that it's clearly by people. And it is quite literally. These are by people who have been studying this, and this is what they love and know and have interacted with. And as much as they love it, they've also interacted with the people in it who they probably did not all love. As both of us have had experience working in the show business world, there's a lot of bad people in there.
Yeah, a lot of bad people, a lot of bad situations.
A lot of big egos, a lot of other things that get brought into the working environment outside of just the work itself. Because you think, it'll just be about this show, this film, this thing we're doing here. But no, everybody's got their own human experiences, their previous relationships with people that they've worked with that doesn't always create the most positive work environment.
Yeah, no, to say the least. And so we get to see all of that, right? We get to see like what happens when you have someone whose back has gone out because they've been hunched over with cameras for their entire lives, or when they can't help but drink all the time. And then, again, that it was almost devastating when that one producer tells the director, like, just remember, no one expects art from you. We just want it to be okay. And I was like, oh, and you could see the act, you could see the director's face fall.
And then it's so satisfying when we watch when we get to the third act and we get to see this director act in the film as the director and get to carry out his own kind of like vigilante sense of justice against everyone who has wronged him thus far.
Yes. And, for a film that's ultimately at least playing with horror. I'm not sure if it actually is horror. You know, that last scene where they built the like human pyramid, you know, and they've triumphed together. I mean, it was so satisfying, and that's what you want from a horror comedy, right? I think horror it's more straight horror needs to be, and straight not as in like straight versus queer, but straight as in just horror needs to be, you should walk away and be like, oh no, I am not going to be okay. But I think horror comedy, you should walk away and be like, yay, the world is terrible, but I'm okay with that. And I felt that way right there at the end, because you know the zombies are still out there. If the zombies are consumers of the zombie channel and the producers, they are still in this world, and they are going to keep eating the life and soul of these actors and crew. But for just a brief moment, we're okay with that. So the last thing that I want to mention, and I'm not sure, this is like a half-baked idea, so it may not quite make sense, but
go for it.
Thank you. As you were talking about the reality of like showbiz versus you know the image it propels forward, I was reminded of Singing in the Rain. So I'm a huge fan of plays and of movies in particular that do this, where they, you know, where they're backstage musicals, right? Essentially is like a whole genre. Because as someone that's been an actor, that's done some directing, like I just love it. But films like Singing in the Rain and also La La Land are both guilty of this. Even as they show you the, quote, dirty or difficult truth of the industry, right? That, you know, people aren't actually in love just because they pretend to be on screen, or that, you know, that the voice that you hear may not be the voice that's actually happening, or, you know, that it's a tough gig and you might not get your big break, right? Both of those films really kind of like play with those ideas, but at the end of the day, even though they show you that it's a slightly broken system, they're also saying, but isn't Hollywood kind of amazing, right? Like, isn't this life, this dream gorgeous? And I liked, and I think that this is where One Cut of the Dead actually gets to be horror, but also just clearly not a Hollywood film. This film was like, no, it's actually not terrific. It's not great. And the fact that we keep allowing ourselves to be consumed is as ridiculous as if a zombie victim just went up to a zombie and said, go ahead and keep eating. And I think that is, again, something that I don't think could ever be accomplished in a Hollywood setting, but also that's what makes this film potentially horror, is that it's not entirely affirmative at the end, right? It is saying the system is broken. We're just all still trapped in it. And that was, you know, that's a really deep thing to be doing in a film about a film about a film. Yeah,
because you're absolutely right. At the core, it's still kind of presenting some pretty horrific working conditions. Some pretty bad things happen because of just, like, the laziness of the people at the top, or just, like, literally the ineptitude, or if not ineptitude, just the literal fact that they just truly don't care. Because the only thing that matters to them is that you create a thing, that you produce a thing, a commodity, that they can profit off of. And, it's not entirely affirmative. You're absolutely right, because it doesn't say that the problem is these one producers, though. It's like, the problem is everyone feeding into this whole thing.
The problem is that there is enough interest in bad, unthoughtful horror that they can create a zombie channel that's just going to be whatever is on. And I'm going to make one more, I think there is one more way in which this becomes a really interesting zombie film. Despite, again, the director apparently doesn't care, and writer.
Yeah, I mean, the director-writer just truly has no interest in the way that this film operates and works as a zombie film. Which is interesting, because he does seem to have made, in spite of the fact that he doesn't care, he has still kind of made an excellent encapsulation of what is at the heart of the zombie film.
He has, because the other thing that's really interesting, so I talked about the idea that it's often about a group of people that band together, but one of the things I always find really interesting is that, you know, like, zombie films always put together like the weirdest group of people, right? So people that would never interact in any other circumstance. And we never really see, although it'd be delightful to see the movie after the apocalypse, where like you awkwardly run into one of your former crew in the grocery store and you're like, remember when we like killed hundreds of people together? See you later, right? Like, but there's something very similar to the way that working on a production is, right? Like, where in that moment you couldn't be closer with that group of family of like people. They are your family. You know them better than you've known anyone.
You're close to them on a way that is so artificially manufactured.
Yes.
But that does not, just because it's artificially created, that does not lessen the intensity of the forced connection.
Yes. And like you all have, despite the infighting, despite the like often incestuous like relationships, despite all of it, that there always comes a moment in every show I've been a part of, at least, where it's like, but you know what? It's time to rise above. And that is a trope in the zombie genre as well. And so it works really nicely to make it be that like we get to see that in the real world there are also instances of these artificially enforced intimacies that then afterwards you're like, oh yeah, I went from seeing you every day to like seeing you once a year. That's odd. And so I just think again that this actually works as a fantastic zombie film.
I mean, these people have to band together for survival. In this case, they've got to in the typical zombie film, survival against zombies and this mass of people like that. In this film, it's survival because they've all got to get paid. They're all just regular Joes who are like, this is about that money. I gotta be able to survive, and so they band together. Yeah, I mean, super interesting ways in which it operates as a zombie film, despite not being a zombie film. Apparently,
right. Which I guess we end with me just saying like, thank you for constantly prodding me to watch this film, because it does deserve the accolades and the recognition it gets.
Absolutely.
And it's fun, but more importantly, it's thoughtful.
It really is, and it's really delightful. It couldn't have happened to a better movie, and it was only intended to have a 6-day run at a theater, and now here we are. It's won a bunch of different awards. It's on Shudder now, which has been huge for this movie.
Yes.
And expanding its audience. And I just really, if you have not seen One Cut of the Dead, first of all, why did you listen to this whole thing?
I was going to say, like,
so many spoilers.
Who's listening to this episode without having seen the film? But on the off chance that you just, need to listen to our voices regularly, regardless of what we say, you should go watch this film. And if you have seen it, you should watch it again.
Thank you so much for joining us. It has been an absolutely delightful time getting to talk about this film. It's truly a treat.
And we are going to rotate back to our occasional forays into the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And so up next is going to be
1988's A Nightmare on Elm Street 4: The Dream Master.
Excellent. So we hope that you will join us for that episode. And in the meantime, of course, please be sure to follow us on social media.
Check out our YouTube page where we will be uploading a spooky scrap over this next week. So be sure to check out that video and subscribe on there for more video content from us. And in the meantime, have a spooktacular day.